At a time when the world seemed to be falling apart, two men, Paul and Rudolf, sought a new map for faith. They lived in a Germany marked by turmoil and the rise of ideologies that promised certainty but delivered emptiness. Faith, once seen as a set of historical facts and unshakable dogmas, had become cold, a dusty relic amid scientific progress. They no longer found resonance in the old answers. They sought something more, a meaning that touched them deep within. It was in this context of crisis that German existential philosophy entered the scene. Paul and Rudolf saw it not as a threat, but as compass. The words of Heidegger and Jasper echoed in their Minda. They spoke of the anguish of being, of the freedom and predefined guides. For existentialist critique, truth lay not in an abstract idea or a past event, but in the experience of existence, in the confrontation with non-being, and in the act of having the courage to be. Paul, the philosopher theologian, walked through this world of questions with a method in his backpack: correlation. He believed that theology could no longer remain in its ivory tower, soaking a language no one understood. Instead, it should dialogue. Every existential question, the anxiety of futility, the emptiness of meaning, had an answer in the Christian tradition. But these answers were no literal. The resurrection was not just a historical fact, but a symbol that spoke of the victory of life over death, of the courage to be in the midst of non-being. Paul felt that his job was to be the bridge between the profound abyss of the human soul and the ground of being, which he called God. For him, faith was an act of courage, an acceptance of life in its fullness and in its contradictions. Rudolf, on the other hand, felt called to a more radical task: demythologization. He looked at the New Testament narratives and saw a tangle of mythical language, intelligible to the 20th century mind. Modern man, accustomed to science and technology, could no longer accept a three-story cosmos, with angels and demons flitting between heaven and hell. He believed that this mythology was a barrier, an obstacle that prevented people from hearing the true message of the gospel. For Rudolf, the central message of Christianity lay not in miracles or accounts of supernatural events, but in an existential call. The proclamation, the kerygma, that life in Christ is new life, a break with the past and a choice for an authentic existence. The resurrection, for example, was not a physical event, but a decision of faith that gave new happening in the present, in life of each individual. He felt his mission was to free the essence of faith from its mythological garb, so that it could be heard and lived as a personal decision. Thus Paul and Rudolf, each in their own way, challenged the status quo. They rejected faith as mere intellectual assent to dogma and facts. In their connection, they presented it as a radically human act, a personal journey, and an existential response. They brought the divine back to the ground of human experience, a place where anguish and hope walk hand in hand, and where faith is, above all, a matter of the soul.
The German existentialist school, the main influence for both, and what places them within the German existentialist school, it's the work of philosophers such as Martin Heidegger and Karl Jasper. Martin Heidegger, Heidegger's philosophy, particularly his work Being and Time, was crucial for Rudolf Bultmann. Heidegger explored concepts such as being in the world, better known as Dyson, anguish, and authenticity. Bultmann applied these concepts to biblical hermeneutics, arguing that the message of the New Testament is not about historical facts and mythical miracles, but about an existential call to authentic faith. Paul Tillich. Although Tillich engaged with various philosophical currents, his theology was also profoundly shaped by German existential philosophy. He utilized concepts such as existential anguish, non-being, and the courage to be. For Tillich, faith is not a belief in dogmatic propositions, but the act of having the courage to accept one's own existence and find the ground of being, that is, God, personal amid finitude and anxiety. German existentialist theology, in turn, was strongly influenced by the Danish existentialism of Søren Kierkegaard, who is considered the father of existentialism. Kierkegaard emphasized individual responsibility, subjectivity, and the importance of faith as a leap into the abyss, an irrational choice in the face of the uncertainties of existence. To understand Tillich and Rudolf's thinking, it is essential to contextualize it in a moment of cultural and religious crisis, THR post-Enlightenment context. Liberal theology of the 19th century attempted to harmonize faith with scientific rationalism, but in trying to make Christianity palatable to the modern Mindist, it ended up emptying it of its power and mystery. Well, let's try to make this video relevant. I focus on the context of liberal theology post-Enlightenment. 19th century liberal theology was not a complete failure, but rather the result of a strategy that, in attempting to solve one problem, ended up creating another. Liberal theology was born of a noble intention, to make faith relevant to modern man, who had embraced rationalism, science, and historical ethics as a source of truth. It aimed to save Christianity from obsolescence by showing that it was compatible with the new mentality. However, this attempt led to its emptying for the reasons. First, the reduction of the supernatural to the natural. To harmonize faith with scientific rationalism, liberal theology sought to explain biblical events in a way that was acceptable to science. For example, the resurrection was not seen as a supernatural event, but as a symbolic or spiritual power. And the healing of the blind was a way of restoring human dignity. When I was younger, I thought that the healing of blind was the opening of man's inner vision to spiritual life. I thought that the high salinity of the Dead Sea would allow some pyrotechnic event that would allow Jesus to walk on water. Look what I thought. Okay, flocks. The divinity of Christ began to be seen as a great moral and ethical teacher, a model human being, rather than as an incarnate Son of God, which diminished his singularity. By trying to remove what was unbelievable to science, liberal theology sacrificed the mystery and power that have always been central to the Christian faith. Salvation became a matter of following Jesus' example, rather than an act of divine intervention. The loss of existential meaning, this being the second understanding of the issue, as existentialism, as discussed before, emphasizes personal experience and anguish. By focusing on Jesus as an ethical model, liberal theology distanced faith from profound issues such as sin, the anguish of death, and the need or social failing. Redemption ceased to be a divine act of grace and became a human quest for improvement. That thinned understanding is based on an excessive focus on historical criticism. Liberal theology used historical criticism to question the authorship and authenticity of parts of the Bible. The Bible ceased to be the inspired and infallible Word of God and became a historical document, subject to the same analysis as any other ancient text. Liberal theology, in attempting to make Christianity acceptable to the social justice and more open dialogue with other religions, it was in this void that the existentialist theology of Tillich and Rudolf attempted to fill, rescuing faith not a moral philosophy or a science, but as a response to the anguish of human existence.
Well, folks, what actually led Tillich to his mystical interpretation of faith, that is, his transmutation from the literal to the mystical? Well, we have to consider that existentialism was only part of the equation. Tillich's mystical interpretation of faith has deeper roots than just existentialist philosophy. It is the result of a fusion of other philosophical and theological currents, which came together to create his unique system. Before existentialism, German Romanticism had already criticized the strict rationalism of the Enlightenment. So, there's a connection. Romantic philosophers and poets like Friedrich Schleiermacher and Goethe argued that truth lay not only in reason, but also in intuition, feeling, and individual experience. For Thurm, religion was not a set of rational dogmas, but a feeling of absolute dependence or an intuition of the infinite. Tillich, in a way, inherent this romantic sensibility. He also values the non-rational, the symbolic, and personal experience as pathways to the sacred. The idea that the Bible and faith speak of something that ultimately concerns us is a direct verbiage of this perspective. Germany has a long tradition of Christian mysticism, dating back to figures like Meister Eckhart and Jacob Boehme. These mystics sought a direct and personal union with God, transcending the literal and institutional forms of religion. They spoke of a ground of being, the ground where God and human beings meet at a level deeper than reason can comprehend. Tillich, in using the expression the ground of being to describe God, aligns with this tradition. He is saying that God is not a being at the top of the ski, but the ultimate reality that lies at the heart of all that exists. This mystical vision, which always sought to go beyond the literal, is what allows Tillich to assert that Christian symbols, such as the cross and the resurrection, point to a deeper and more transformative reality, one that cannot be contained in a simple literal statement. The role of existentialism. So where does existentialism is not the fit in? Existentialism is not the source of Tillich's mysticism, but the analytical tool he used to translate and to speak about the anguish, finitude, and alienation of modern human beings. Mysticism gave him the answer to these questions, union as the ground of being which transcends finitude. What exactly did Tillich do? Instead of using mystical language that modern human would not understand analytical tool, he used to translate it to the modern world. Existentialism gave Tillich a language to speak about the anguish, finitude, and alienation of modern human beings. Mysticism gave him the answer to these questions, union as the ground of being, which transcends finitude. What exactly did Tillich do? Instead of using mystical language that modern humans would not understand, Tillich translated this experience into existential language. He wasn't questioning the wrong philosophical current, but rather using it strategically to connect Christian mysticism to a world that had lost its sense of the sacred. Thus we have in Tillich a thinker who united existentialism, romanticism, and mysticism to create a system of thought that could speak to the sacred rather than the secular.
Rudolf Bultman and Paul Tillich were both influenced by the same intellectual currents and worked, albeit separately, to make the Christian faith relevant to modernity. They shared the same intellectual home, German existentialism, and the same problems, the emptying of faith, liberal theology, but proposed fundamentally different solutions. Rudolf Bultman's main focus is hermeneutics, or the art of interpretation. His goal was to strip the gospel of what he considered the mystical and historical garb of the 1st century AD. He saw miracles and supernatural accounts as obstacles that prevented modern man from hearing the true kerygma, the message of salvation. For him, the gospel is not about what Jesus did in the past, but about what Christ means for the existence of modern man. Paul Tillich's main focus was systematics and philosophy. His method of correlation sought to connect humanistic existential questions, analyzed by philosophy, with the symbolic responsibilities of the Christian faith. He wanted not only to demytologize the Bible, but, more broadly, to translate the language of faith into the language of modern culture. Bultman viewed the Christian faith as a core of meaning wrapped in shells, myths, history, dogmas, somewhere around 6 or 7 different theologies, dozens of philosophical concepts. He saw his task as that of an archaeologist or miner, removing the layers, the myths, to find the treasure, the existential kerygma. And Tillich saw his task as that of an interpreter. He did remove the shells, the symbols, but used them as bridges to connect the inner meaning with the experience of the modern soul. Well, now you ask me, what does that German ideology have to do with all of this? In fact, German ideology is a rich philosophical and theological tradition that profoundly influenced both. Existentialism, Heidegger and Jasper, gave them the tools to speak about anguish, freedom, decision, and individual responsibility. The German Romanticism found in Schleiermacher contributed to the valorization of personal experience, feeling, and intuition as pathways to the divine. The German mysticism found in Meister Eckhart provided Tillich with the language to speak of God as the ground of being, something deeper than a simple entity in the sky. Bultman and Tillich did not reflect each other, but like two brothers who grew up in the same house, they incorporated and reinterpreted the same influences in unique ways. Bultman focused on the content of the gospel, and Tillich on the relationship between faith and culture. But both agreed that Christian faith is not about literal facts, but about an existential decision that transforms life. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching the video.